But I say it wasn't very easy in Yemen. I remember as chief elected monitor being summoned to one of the biggest cities, which was halfway up a mountain, where the opposition wanted to lodge a complaint against the government. And so I said, well, what's the complaint? And I walked into this room, and both the opposition and the government locally were around the same table, glaring at each other. I said, oh dear, I'm so sorry, what's the problem? And the opposition rather nervously said, well, the government keeps shooting our gatherings, and they keep killing our supporters. Oh dear, I said, I'm so sorry, how does this happen? Well, they're doing it from an aeroplane, and they're using government aeroplanes. So I turned to the government people and I said, oh dear, that's not quite right, is it? You're not allowed to use government vehicles in election campaigning. Well, my limitation was very clear. You know, there's almost nothing I could do. So then I said to the government, could you tell me why you're using government aeroplanes to shoot their gatherings? Well, it's only fair. They have shouldered rocket missiles. They're shooting back. So I said to them both, I said to the whole cluster, I said, look here, it's going to be very, very difficult indeed for me to write a report saying that this is a free and fair election. If you go on doing this, I shall have to go and talk to Mr. President. Are you prepared to stop? So surprisingly enough, both sides stopped. It was quite amazing. But Yemen is a complicated place. And, but fascinating. Surprisingly, Al-Qaeda attacked us. And that was a bit exhausting. And I went to see Mr. President. They attacked our hotel. There was a huge fight, massive fight. And the President sent for me. And when I came in, he was very proud, and he said, it's absolutely wonderful. We resolved this problem. 8 of the 9 are dead, and the 9th had the map of your bedroom in his pocket. And he said, we did all of that, he said, without recourse to the Americans or the British or the Europeans or anybody else. Oh, I said, I'm so pleased, how very clever of you. And when I went away, I learned that these 9 gentlemen who'd been killed or not killed were actually part of the Al-Qaeda 18 men who'd been in prison. And they'd tunneled out. And so, of course, they knew who they were. And then the remaining 9 didn't get caught, and they then attacked the American ambassador several years later. However, the interesting thing was that Yemen then had another election several years later, about 2 or 3 years ago, and I went back as chief election monitor again. Nobody else came, but nonetheless, they desperately wanted to vote. Of course, not all places are quite as difficult as that, but the fascination is how much people respect the democratic systems that we've been promoting from the West, how much they want to be part of this system, how much they want the liberal values. Even though they're far, far away from them, this is their goal. And I could tell you of many, many constituents, many, many people in many parts of the world, Africa and India and the Middle East and in Central and South America, where now the voting box, the ballot box and the vote is absolutely critical, and where they want the democracy that we have. It does in some places seem very, very far away, and I do find sometimes colleagues are rather difficult, particularly the OSCE, which is a bit complicated. They insisted, for example, on declaring a Georgia election free and fair, whereas actually halfway through the afternoon the defence minister had gone into a polling booth in his own counting place, in his own constituency, had produced a machine gun, shot around a bit and then left. But it wasn't precisely free and fair for me. And another one, I think it was Armenia, where the opposition the leader of the opposition the following day was found dead, bound up in tape, poor man, choked to death. And that was a free and fair election. Kazakhstan was another great difficulty, where a free and fair election was supposed to be happening. And I've never seen such beautiful corruption in my entire life. It's absolute ace corruption I've ever seen anywhere of any of the election in Kazakhstan. And the electorate wasn't watching, of course, because this was at the count. And I managed to get my messages through, and luckily 2 or 3 other people had spotted it. So right up at the top, the leader of our delegation was able to say it wasn't free and fair, at which the president of Kazakhstan proved us correct, absolutely correct. He promptly announced, in that case, the EU delegation cannot leave until it changes its statement. Yes, wasn't it lovely? It was beautiful. We were right, absolutely lovely. And I was in the south. The rest were in the capital city. And I was in the south, and I realized that I was quite close to a gateway into Iran, a rather circuitous route. And so I telephoned the president's office and said, please don't worry about me, I'm leaving via Iran. At which I was promptly sent out of the country, pronto, put on an aeroplane immediately, because clearly in some sort of a way I must have been dangerous to them, I don't know how. And that caused me a lot of problems. That meant I got back to Brussels 2 days before the colleagues did, who'd refused to change their statement and genuinely weren't allowed to leave. So I was the guilty party for managing to get out earlier. So that wasn't very easy either. And there is a politicization, sometimes in the team itself. A Palestine election, I still feel very raw about that. It was an international delegation. I was a part of it from Brussels. And I was in Gaza Strip when a very strong message came through to say that I had to leave because I was going to be kidnapped. And it wasn't possible to leave, it was late at night. And the message came from Washington to Whitehall to Brussels, down to Gaza. Well, there wasn't anything I could do at that hour of the night, so I had to stay. And the following day, I had to stay as well, because it wasn't possible. It was voting, and it was impossible to get out. And so I sat and watched in the middle, heavily guarded. And I was able to see what went on. And at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they changed the system. And they sent out an announcement to say that you no longer had to show your ID card to vote. Yes. And instead of the polling stations shutting at 5, the polling stations would shut at 11. So of course everybody got the message, and they went back and back and back and back and back and voted and voted and voted and voted and voted. I went back to, when I got out again, and went back to, we were in Jerusalem, I think it was, or Tel Aviv, and complained, which I was firmly told by the International Monitoring Committee, who was monitoring the election, I was just one person, that I must shut up because the West wanted Arafat to win, and that was enough of that. So this monstrously corrupt election, which was then heavily quoted year upon year as actually genuine, it was one of the most corrupt elections I've ever seen. Very difficult indeed. So this is a tool, and it's an important tool, but it's a tool that can be very easily distorted and bastardized and changed and shifted, and I can give you many other examples of that. And I am beginning to wonder whether we should restrict our monitoring to countries that are genuinely democratic, because that's where it really counts. That's where we know we can tell the truth. Because these election monitoring reports, they're now used by the countries in question for International Monetary Fund, for World Bank accreditation, all sorts of things like that. And I do wonder whether we should start to restrict this to the countries that we know are genuinely proper democracies or pretty close to being proper democracies. I'll give you Moldova as another example. That was very difficult to spot, really difficult to spot. I mean, almost 100% difficult to spot. And I made a complaint. And the team was very much dominated by the Russians, OSCE. They had about 150 observers there. It's a tiny country, as you know. And I objected, and it wasn't accepted. And so I did something odd. I went back to Brussels and did something you're not allowed to do. After all, if you're part of a team, you're part of a team. And I made some big statements out of Brussels, which immediately went on the television everywhere. And the result was I got 5 telephone calls from the president and another 5 telephone calls from the prime minister saying, what should we do? I said, well, if I were you, I'd hold the election again. At the very least, you've got to have a proper recount. Anyway, I don't know if it was me, but that was what happened. And the corruption was enormous. and the whole thing shifted and the different sort got in. But it is so difficult because of the cleverness. That was electronic corruption. They had changed the whole system, all the coding and everything in the computer. So my feeling is that this is a tool that it would be a great deal better if we can possibly restrain ourselves and just use it for a fairly rare occasion. Well, now we are moving into a very, very difficult time indeed. We've talked, I'm sure, informally about Paris today, and we've talked also about some of the other problems that we face. I'd like to remind you, just for one moment, as to the comments made by the European Strategy and Policy Analytical System, which declared last Thursday, just before the Paris attack, and I quote, "The world is becoming steadily more complex, more challenging, and also more insecure. The scope for massive, quote, negative game changers on a global scale is considerable, and business as usual will not be enough for Europe to hold its ground in a rapidly changing and more demanding global world." I suggest that we've had an absolutely magnificent 50 years. We've been astoundingly fortunate. We've had peace, we've had prosperity, we've had solidarity, and we've had cohesion. And I think now we've got to be flexible, we've got to be fast on our feet, we've got to be adaptable, because there's a new Europe that lies ahead. I think it's going to work, but we're going to have to work extremely hard at it. I honour Mrs. Merkel's first speech as European Union President that I had the honour to hear in the European Parliament in 2007. And she declared from her heart, she declared the European Union is a wonderful house. In fact, I find it more beautiful on the inside than from the outside. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, I don't ever want to leave this house. I am convinced that there is no better place to live than in our shared home, the house of Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to fight to keep that house secure now, and it's our job to do just that. And I speak as a Briton before the referendum next June. Thank you very much.